They didn't know the black man who was refused service was their boss. Nathaniel Carter adjusted his simple navy blazer as he stepped through the polished glass doors of Briarwood Grill, his eyes taking in the familiar symphony of clinking glasses and muted conversations that filled Chicago's premier dining establishment. At 45, he moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had built an empire from nothing, though today he looked like any other patron seeking a good meal on this crisp Tuesday afternoon. The restaurant hummed with its usual lunchtime energy, white tablecloths catching the light from crystal chandeliers, servers gliding between tables with practiced grace, the soft murmur of business deals being struck over perfectly prepared entrees. Nathaniel's gaze swept across the dining room. He knew like the back of his hand. Every corner, every table, every detail a testament to 15 years of careful planning and execution. He had built this place, along with 17 others across the Midwest, into something more than just restaurants. They were sanctuaries of culinary excellence where people came to celebrate life's important moments. But today, dressed in his understated business casual attire, with no entourage or fanfare to announce his arrival, he was invisible, just another face in the crowd. What none of the bustling staff or well-dressed patrons could possibly know was that the quiet black man who had just walked through their doors owned every square inch of polished marble beneath their feet. And what was about to unfold would change everything, not just for him, not just for this restaurant, but for every person who would witness what happened next. Nathaniel approached the hostess station with the same easy stride he used in boardrooms, his hands relaxed at his sides. The young woman behind the podium, her nameplate read Madison, was scrolling through her phone, blonde hair perfectly styled, her attention completely absorbed by whatever was happening on her screen. She didn't look up when he approached, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way that would suggest she was aware a customer was waiting. After nearly 30 seconds of being ignored, Nathaniel cleared his throat gently. "Excuse me." Madison's head snapped up with an expression of barely concealed irritation, as if he had interrupted something far more important than her job. Her eyes traveled from his face down to his clothes and back up again, a journey that took perhaps 3 seconds but felt loaded with judgment. The smile that had been automatic for the previous 3 customers, all white, all clearly affluent, never appeared. "Do you have a reservation?" The question came out flat, almost accusatory. "I don't, but I was hoping you might have a table for one available." Nathaniel's voice carried the warm professionalism he had perfected in countless business negotiations. Madison made a show of looking at her reservation book, though she had just seated a walk-in couple moments before without any such theatrics. "We're pretty booked up. This is fine dining, you know. Pretty expensive." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Nathaniel felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with these moments, the subtle racism that was never quite overt enough to call out directly, but unmistakable to anyone who had lived with it their entire life. "I understand," he replied, though something tight twisted in his chest, a familiar ache he'd carried since childhood, when teachers assumed he couldn't afford field trips, when store clerks followed him through aisles. Even now, with all his success, the sting felt fresh. From across the dining room, Marcus Williams, the floor manager, had begun to take notice. A 35-year-old man who had worked his way up from server to management over the past 8 years, Marcus had developed what he considered to be excellent instincts about customers. Right now, those instincts were telling him that something was off about the black man at the hostess station. Marcus began making his way across the restaurant, weaving between tables with purposeful strides. He had dealt with situations like this before, people who wandered in off the street thinking they belonged in an establishment like Briarwood Grill. It was nothing personal, he told himself, just business. Madison finally looked up from her book with an expression of feigned surprise. "Oh, actually, I think we might have something available. but it's not in our main dining area." She led Nathaniel to a small table, tucked away in a corner near the service station, partially hidden behind a decorative plant, and clearly the least desirable seat in the house. The nearby tables were empty, not because they were reserved, but because no one wanted to sit in what was essentially the restaurant's version of Siberia. "This is the only table we have available," Madison said with practiced insincerity, gesturing toward the cramped corner spot. Nathaniel glanced around the dining room, noting at least 6 empty tables in prime locations, but simply nodded. "This will be fine, thank you." As he settled into his seat, he caught Marcus watching him from across the room, the manager's expression a mixture of suspicion and something that looked remarkably like disdain. Nathaniel opened the menu, the same menu he had personally approved every item on, and waited to see what would happen next. The stage was set, though no one in the restaurant realized they were about to become players in a drama that would be talked about for years to come. Jenny Rodriguez approached the corner table with the kind of reluctant energy usually reserved for unpleasant chores. As a server with 4 years of experience at Briarwood Grill, she had developed a finely tuned sense of which tables would tip well and which ones would be a waste of her time. The black man sitting alone in the worst section of the restaurant clearly fell into the latter category. "What can I get you?" she asked without preamble. No greeting, no smile, her pen already poised over her notepad as if she wanted to get this interaction over with as quickly as possible. Nathaniel looked up from the menu with a pleasant expression. "Good afternoon. I'd love to start with a look at your wine list, if you don't mind." Jenny's eyebrows rose. "Our wines are pretty pricey. You sure?" For a moment, Nathaniel felt 15 years old again, standing in his high school guidance counselor's office being told that people like him should consider community college instead of Harvard. The casual dismissal, the automatic assumption of inadequacy, it still had the power to make his chest tighten with hurt and anger. He took a quiet breath, steadying himself. "I'm sure," he said simply. Jenny reluctantly produced the wine list. "I'll have the 2018 Bordeaux," Nathaniel said after reviewing the selections, wines he had personally chosen for their quality and value. "I'm going to need to see a credit card first." The words hung between them like a slap. At nearby tables, other patrons were ordering similar bottles without anyone questioning their ability to pay. The couple at the table closest to them had just ordered a $300 bottle of champagne without so much as showing identification. Nathaniel reached into his wallet and pulled out his black American Express Centurion card, the invitation-only credit card with no spending limit that fewer than 1% of Americans qualified for. He handed it to Jenny, who examined it with the suspicion of a customs agent inspecting a questionable passport. "I'll need to run this first," she said, already walking away before Nathaniel could respond. Marcus Williams had been watching the interaction from across the restaurant, and something about the exchange bothered him. Not the server's behavior. That seemed perfectly reasonable when dealing with someone who clearly didn't belong in an establishment like Briarwood. What bothered him was the customer's composure. Most people would have gotten angry by now, would have made a scene or demanded to speak to a manager. This guy was just sitting there, calm as could be, like he owned the place. Marcus decided it was time to get involved. He approached with the authoritative stride of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. "Good afternoon. I'm Marcus Williams, the floor manager. I want to make sure you understand this is a fine dining establishment with premium pricing." Nathaniel looked up at him with steady eyes. "I'm quite familiar with your establishment. I'd hate for anyone to have an unpleasant surprise when the check arrives." The condescension was so thick it was almost visible. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm confident I can handle it." Marcus lingered longer than necessary. "I'll be keeping an eye on things to make sure everything goes smoothly." As Marcus walked away, Nathaniel pulled out his phone and sent a brief text message. Need you at Briarwood in 30 minutes. Bring the files. Then he set the phone down and continued reading the menu. His menu, while around him the restaurant continued its elaborate dance of discrimination, blissfully unaware that they were performing for the one person who had the power to shut down the entire show. The wine service became a spectacle of passive aggression. Jenny returned from the kitchen with the bottle of Bordeaux, but not before making Nathaniel wait 20 minutes while she attended to every other table in her section, including tables that had been seated after him. She presented the bottle with the enthusiasm of someone handling toxic waste, performing the traditional wine presentation ritual with barely concealed hostility. "Your wine," she said flatly, making no effort to hide her skepticism as she poured a small amount for him to taste. Nathaniel swirled the wine, inhaled its bouquet, and nodded his approval. The same wine he had selected personally from the vineyard in Bordeaux 3 years earlier during a buying trip for the restaurant group. "It's perfect, thank you." As Jenny poured his glass with deliberate slowness, clearly hoping to drag out the process and make it as awkward as possible, a new player entered the scene. Richard Sterling, a 58-year-old attorney who lunched at Briarwood twice a week, had noticed the situation at the corner table and decided he didn't like what he was seeing. Sterling was the kind of man who believed his regular patronage of upscale establishments gave him certain rights and privileges. He was also the kind of man who had very specific ideas about who belonged in those establishments and who didn't. The sight of a black man drinking expensive wine in his restaurant was enough to ruin his entire meal. He stood up from his table, a prime spot in the center of the dining room, and walked purposefully toward Marcus, his voice loud enough to be heard at surrounding tables. "I need to speak with you about the service situation," Sterling announced, not bothering to lower his voice. "I'm a regular customer here, and frankly, I'm not comfortable with the current atmosphere." Marcus nodded sympathetically. "What seems to be the problem, Mr. Sterling?" "That individual over there," Sterling said, gesturing toward Nathaniel without any attempt at discretion, "is creating a disturbance. I come here for a peaceful, refined dining experience, and I shouldn't have to deal with people who obviously don't understand the environment they're in." The racism was no longer subtle. It was laid bare for the entire restaurant to see. And yet somehow it was being treated as a legitimate complaint by the management. Marcus glanced over at Nathaniel, who was quietly reading something on his phone while sipping his wine. "I understand your concern, Mr. Sterling. Let me see what I can do." For the second time that afternoon, Marcus approached Nathaniel's table, but this time his demeanor had shifted from condescending to openly hostile. "Sir, I'm going to need you to keep it down over here. We've received complaints about noise from your table." Nathaniel looked around the quiet corner where he sat alone, then back at Marcus. "I'm not making any noise. Look, you're making our other customers uncomfortable. Maybe you should consider whether this is really the right establishment for someone in your situation." The words were chosen carefully, designed to be offensive without being legally actionable. But they hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and several nearby tables had stopped their conversations to listen. In the corner of the restaurant, barely noticed by anyone, a 22-year-old college student named David Kim had quietly opened his phone and started a live stream. He had witnessed the entire interaction from the beginning, and his instincts told him this was about to become something bigger than just bad service. His stream started with 0 viewers, but within minutes, as word spread through social media, the number began to climb. "Yo, chat, you're not going to believe what I'm witnessing right now," David whispered into his phone. "This is straight-up discrimination happening live at this fancy restaurant in Chicago." Richard Sterling, emboldened by Marcus's response, decided to make his position even clearer. He walked over to Nathaniel's table himself, looking down at the seated man with undisguised contempt. "I don't know what you're trying to prove here," Sterling said, his voice carrying across the now quiet restaurant. "But this isn't the place for people like you. Maybe you should try somewhere more appropriate to your background. The final word was delivered with particular venom, and the meaning was unmistakable to everyone in the restaurant. This was no longer about service or pricing or noise complaints. This was about race, pure and simple. Nathaniel set down his wineglass and looked up at Sterling with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. These procedures seem to be targeted at a very specific type of customer, he said quietly. Then he picked up his phone and sent another text. Emergency meeting. Now. His eyes met Sterling's without flinching. But I wonder if you gentlemen have any idea who you're actually dealing with. On David Kim's live stream, the viewer count had jumped to over 500, and the comments were pouring in faster than anyone could read them. But the real show was just getting started. The confrontation that had been simmering beneath the surface of polite society finally erupted into full view. Marcus Williams, emboldened by Richard Sterling's support and the apparent backing of his regular customers, decided it was time to escalate the situation to its logical conclusion. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to settle your bill and leave," Marcus announced, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "You're disrupting the dining experience of our other guests." Nathaniel remained seated, his posture relaxed, his voice steady. "I'm not disrupting anything. I'm simply having lunch. You're arguing with staff, making unreasonable demands, and creating a hostile environment." Marcus shot back, his voice rising. "This is a private establishment, and we have the right to refuse service to anyone we choose." The legal language was carefully chosen, but everyone in the restaurant understood what was really happening. This was about race, and everyone knew it. Richard Sterling moved closer to the table, his face flushed with indignation. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. First you come in here acting like you belong, ordering expensive wine, and now you're refusing to leave when asked politely. What's next?" The implication was clear and ugly, rooted in centuries of racist stereotypes about black men being dangerous and threatening. Other diners began to look uncomfortable, but not because they were witnessing discrimination. They were uncomfortable because they felt threatened by Nathaniel's mere presence. Jenny had returned from the kitchen with backup, 2 other servers who had been watching the drama unfold. "Should we call the police?" she asked Marcus loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That might be necessary," Marcus replied, pulling out his phone. "We can't have people disrupting our business." The absurdity was breathtaking. A man sitting quietly, drinking wine and reading his phone was being treated like a public menace. But in the twisted logic of systemic racism, his very presence in that space was seen as an act of aggression. David Kim's live stream had exploded to over 2,000 viewers, and the comment section was a mixture of outrage and disbelief. "Call the cops on him for what?" one viewer typed. "This is America in 2024, y'all," wrote another. "I'm recording this for my civil rights class," came from a third. But David kept his phone low and his voice barely audible, not wanting to draw attention to himself and lose access to what was clearly becoming a historic moment of documented discrimination. Madison, the hostess who had started the entire chain of events, had called for backup of a different sort. 2 large men in security uniforms appeared from the restaurant's office, off-duty police officers who worked private security for Briarwood during busy lunch hours. "We have a situation at table 23, she told them, pointing toward Nathaniel's corner. The security guards approached with the kind of casual authority that suggested they had done this before. To them, this was just another case of someone who didn't belong making trouble in a place they had no business being. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us," the larger of the 2 guards said, his hand resting casually on his belt where his handcuffs would normally hang. Nathaniel looked up at the guards, then at Marcus, then at the crowd of restaurant staff and customers who had gathered to watch the spectacle. For the first time since he had entered the restaurant, he allowed a small smile to cross his lips. "Actually," he said, reaching for his phone as it began to buzz with an incoming call, "I think you're going to want to wait just a few more minutes." Through the restaurant's front windows, 3 black SUVs could be seen pulling up to the curb. Men in expensive suits began stepping out of the vehicles, their movements crisp and purposeful. Marcus glanced toward the windows, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face for the first time. "Who did you call?" "My employees," Nathaniel replied simply. The confusion on Marcus's face was almost comical. "Your employees?" "My CFO, my head of legal, and my director of operations," Nathaniel clarified, his voice carrying a new note of authority that hadn't been there before. "I figured they should see firsthand how their colleagues treat the owner of this establishment." The words hit the restaurant like a physical blow. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Servers froze in place. Even Richard Sterling took a step backward, his face suddenly pale. "Owner," Marcus whispered, the color draining from his cheeks. The front door of Briarwood Grill opened, and 3 men in impeccable suits walked in with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly where you belong and why you're there. The leader of the group, a tall white man in his 50s, surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades cleaning up other people's mistakes. "Good afternoon." Michael Thompson, Chief Financial Officer of Carter Restaurant Group, announced to the suddenly silent restaurant. "I'm looking for my boss, Nathaniel Carter." He spotted Nathaniel still seated at his corner table, surrounded by security guards and restaurant staff, and his expression darkened considerably. "There he is," Michael said, his voice carrying across the entire dining room. "The owner and CEO of this restaurant and 16 others just like it." The silence that followed Michael Thompson's announcement was so complete that the gentle hum of the restaurant's air conditioning seemed to roar. Marcus Williams stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as the full magnitude of what had just been revealed hit him like a freight train. That's impossible," Marcus stammered, looking back and forth between Michael and Nathaniel. "He can't be. The owner is a 45-year-old African-American businessman who built this company from a single restaurant 15 years ago." Michael finished coldly. "Nathaniel Carter, my boss and the man you've spent the last hour systematically discriminating against." Richard Sterling, who had been so vocal in his demands that Nathaniel be removed, suddenly found himself speechless. The expensive wine he had been so concerned about? Nathaniel had personally selected it during a buying trip to France. The refined atmosphere he was so worried about protecting? Nathaniel had designed every aspect of it. The second man, who had entered with Michael, stepped forward and introduced himself to the stunned crowd. "James Rodriguez, General Counsel for Carter Restaurant Group. I'll be documenting everything that has transpired here today for our legal review." He pulled out a digital recorder and began speaking into it. "Tuesday, October 15th, 2024, 2:47 p.m. Briarwood Grill, Chicago location. Systematic discrimination against company owner and CEO, documented by multiple witnesses and social media live stream." David Kim nearly dropped his phone when he heard his live stream mentioned. The view count had exploded to over 8,000 people, and the comments were coming so fast they were just a blur of outrage and celebration. The third member of Nathaniel's team, Director of Operations Sarah Chen, had already begun taking photographs of the scene and making notes on her tablet. "I'll need the names of all staff members involved," she announced to no one in particular. "And I'll want to review all security footage from the past 2 hours. Nathaniel finally stood up from his corner table, and suddenly the small, dimly lit spot where they had tried to hide him away seemed to expand. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who was exactly where he belonged, because he was. "Marcus," Nathaniel said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that filled the room. In the 15 years since I opened this restaurant, I have never been more disappointed in what I've witnessed today." Marcus tried to speak, but Nathaniel held up a hand to stop him. "I didn't come here today as an undercover boss trying to catch people doing wrong," Nathaniel continued. "I came here as a customer, wanting to experience what our guests experience, and what I experienced was textbook discrimination that would make any civil rights lawyer salivate." Jenny, who had been hiding behind the other servers, finally found her voice. "Mr. Carter, sir, I had no idea. I never would have—" "You never would have what?" Nathaniel asked. "Treated a black customer differently than a white customer. Asked to see a credit card before allowing someone to order wine. Warned someone about prices based on their appearance. Which part wouldn't you have done?" The questions hung in the air unanswered because there was no good answer to any of them. Richard Sterling, who had been so certain of his moral authority just minutes before, was now backing toward his table, clearly hoping to escape notice. But Nathaniel's eyes found him across the restaurant. "Mr. Sterling," Nathaniel called out, and the attorney froze like a deer in headlights. "Don't leave. James here has some papers for you." The general counsel approached Sterling with a manila folder. "Defamation suit," he said simply. "We'll be seeking damages for the public humiliation of our CEO, along with punitive damages for the racially motivated nature of your comments. You'll be hearing from us." Sterling's face went from pale to ashen. As a lawyer himself, he knew exactly how much trouble he was in. Michael Thompson had been quietly observing the room, taking mental notes of everything he was seeing. "Nathaniel," he said, "I count at least 12 staff members who witnessed this discrimination without intervening. That suggests this isn't an isolated incident." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "I don't think it is." He looked around the restaurant, his restaurant, at the faces of employees and customers who were still trying to process what they had just witnessed. "Which is why we're going to make some changes, effective immediately." The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. Where moments before Nathaniel had been treated as an unwelcome intruder, he was now clearly the person in charge of everyone's future. David Kim's livestream had reached 12,000 viewers, and the story was already being picked up by news outlets. Briarwood Grill was trending on Twitter, and the restaurant's Yelp page was being bombarded with reviews from people who had watched the drama unfold online. But the real reckoning was just beginning. Nathaniel Carter stood in the center of his own restaurant, no longer the quiet customer in the corner, but clearly the person who controlled the fate of everyone in the room. The transformation was remarkable to witness. He had gone from victim to judge in the span of a few sentences, and the power shift was absolute. "Marcus Williams," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years of business leadership. "You are terminated, effective immediately." Marcus's legs seemed to give out slightly. He grabbed the back of a nearby chair for support. "Mr. Carter, please, I didn't know. I have a mortgage, kids in college. You knew exactly what you were doing." Nathaniel replied, without raising his voice. "You saw a black man in your restaurant and decided he didn't belong. You escalated a situation that didn't exist. You called security on a paying customer for the crime of ordering wine while black." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Your 15-year career ends today because you couldn't treat another human being with basic dignity for 15 minutes. Sarah Chen was already on her phone with HR. "Security will escort you out after you return your keys and access cards," she informed Marcus. "Your final paycheck will be mailed to your address on file." Jenny Rodriguez was crying now, understanding that her behavior hadn't gone unnoticed either. "Mr. Carter, I'm so sorry. I swear I didn't mean—" "What exactly didn't you mean?" Nathaniel asked. "Didn't mean to make me wait 20 minutes for wine service while you served every white customer first. Didn't mean to demand to see my credit card before allowing me to order. Didn't mean to treat me like a potential criminal." Jenny had no answer because there was no answer that would make any of it acceptable. "You're suspended pending a full investigation," Nathaniel told her. "We'll be reviewing security footage of your interactions with customers over the past 6 months. If we find a pattern of discriminatory behavior, your employment will be terminated." Madison, the hostess who had started the entire chain of discrimination, was trying to make herself invisible behind her podium, but Nathaniel's attention found her as well. "Madison, approach, please." She walked over on unsteady legs, her face streaked with tears and mascara. "Your behavior today was textbook discrimination," Nathaniel told her. "Seating me in the worst table in the restaurant while better tables were available, warning me about prices based on my appearance, ignoring me while providing immediate service to white customers." Madison nodded miserably, unable to speak. "You'll be attending mandatory diversity training," Nathaniel continued. "This is your last chance. One more incident of discriminatory behavior and you're done. Do we understand each other?" "Yes, sir," Madison whispered. But Nathaniel wasn't finished. He turned his attention to Richard Sterling, who was still standing near his table, the lawsuit papers clutched in his trembling hands. "Mr. Sterling, as an attorney, you should understand the legal implications of what just happened here. Your comments were not only morally reprehensible, they were legally actionable. My legal team will be in touch." Sterling tried to speak, but no words came out. The man who had been so confident in his moral authority just an hour ago was now facing professional and personal ruin. James Rodriguez, still recording, added, "Mr. Sterling, your comments were witnessed by approximately 15,000 people via live stream, and the video is being preserved as evidence. You might want to contact your malpractice insurance carrier." David Kim, still broadcasting to his rapidly growing audience, could hardly believe what he was witnessing. The comments on his stream were a mixture of celebration and amazement. "Justice being served live. This is the best plot twist ever. Karma is real, y'all." Nathaniel looked around the restaurant one more time, his gaze taking in the faces of the remaining staff members, the ones who hadn't participated in the discrimination but hadn't spoken up against it either. "For those of you who witnessed what happened here today and said nothing," he began, "understand that silence in the face of discrimination makes you complicit. We're implementing new policies immediately." Sarah Chen read from her tablet. "Mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff within 30 days, anonymous reporting system for discrimination complaints, regular audits of customer service practices, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior." Michael Thompson added, "We'll also be conducting a complete review of hiring and promotion practices at all 18 restaurant locations. If we find evidence of systemic discrimination, there will be additional terminations." The message was clear. This wasn't just about one restaurant or one incident. This was about changing the entire culture of the company. Chef Eduardo Martinez, who had been watching from the kitchen doorway, finally stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, on behalf of the kitchen staff, I want to apologize. We should have spoken up." Nathaniel nodded. "Eduardo, I appreciate that. The kitchen staff will also be included in the diversity training. Everyone in this organization needs to understand that discrimination is not just morally wrong, it's bad for business." As if to prove his point, Sarah Chen looked up from her phone. "Sir, we're getting calls from local news stations. The live stream has gone viral. This story is already being picked up nationally. Indeed, David Kim's stream had reached over 20,000 viewers, and the hashtag #RestaurantJustice was trending across multiple social media platforms. The story was spreading far beyond Chicago, becoming a symbol of both the persistence of discrimination and the power of accountability. But for Nathaniel Carter, the public relations impact was secondary to the human impact. He had walked into his own restaurant as just another customer and been treated as less than human. Now he was ensuring that no one else would ever face the same treatment in any establishment that bore his name. Nathaniel returned to his corner table, the worst table in his own restaurant, and sat down once again. The irony wasn't lost on him, or on anyone else who had witnessed the past 2 hours of drama. He picked up his wine glass, the same expensive Bordeaux that had caused such a stir, and took a thoughtful sip. The restaurant was still largely silent, the normal buzz of conversation replaced by a tension that was part shame, part fear, and part anticipation. Everyone was waiting to see what the man they had so badly misjudged would say next. "I want everyone to understand something," Nathaniel began, his voice carrying easily across the dining room without needing to be raised. What happened here today wasn't about one bad employee or one isolated incident. It was about a system that allows discrimination to flourish in the shadows. He stood up again, not to intimidate or to claim authority, but simply to address his audience, employees, customers, and the thousands of people watching via live stream, more directly. "I built this restaurant 15 years ago with a simple belief that food brings people together, that around a dinner table, our differences become less important than our shared humanity. Today, we failed that mission spectacularly. A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing their own complicity in what had unfolded. Discrimination doesn't just hurt its immediate victims," Nathaniel continued. "It poisons entire communities. When we judge people by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character, we all become smaller, meaner, less human." David Kim, still streaming to his now 25,000 viewers, found himself nodding along with the impromptu speech. The comments section had evolved from angry outrage to thoughtful reflection. "This man is pure class. How is he so calm after all that?" "Leadership looks like this." Chef Eduardo approached from the kitchen, his chef's coat still pristine white, his expression heavy with remorse. "Mr. Carter, sir, I want to personally apologize. The kitchen staff, we heard what was happening, and we should have spoken up. We should have come out here and said something." Nathaniel extended his hand, and Eduardo shook it gratefully. "Eduardo, you and your team have been with this company for 7 years. You've never shown anything but professionalism and excellence. We all learned something today." The simple gesture of reconciliation seemed to break some of the tension in the room. Other employees began to relax slightly, understanding that their CEO was interested in education and improvement, not just punishment. "I want to be clear about something," Nathaniel said, addressing the room again. "This isn't about political correctness or walking on eggshells. It's about basic human dignity. It's about treating every person who walks through our doors with the same respect you would want for your own family." A young server named Carlos, who had watched the entire incident from across the dining room without intervening, raised his hand hesitantly. "Yes, Carlos. Sir, I saw what was happening, and I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know what to do. I was scared I'd get in trouble if I said something." Nathaniel nodded understandingly. "That's exactly why we're implementing the new policies. No employee should ever fear retaliation for standing up against discrimination. In fact, from now on, failing to report discriminatory behavior will be grounds for discipline." The conversation was being broadcast live to tens of thousands of people, but it felt intimate, like a family discussion after a difficult day. This was leadership in real time, not just the authority to punish wrongdoing, but the wisdom to turn a crisis into an opportunity for growth. "I want to share something with all of you," Nathaniel said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "I've been successful in business, but I've never forgotten what it feels like to be judged by my appearance rather than my abilities. Every black person in America knows that feeling. Many other people of color, immigrants, LGBTQ individuals, they know it too." He paused, looking around the room at faces that were now paying attention in a way they hadn't been when he first walked in. When you have power, whether you're a CEO, a manager, a server, or just a customer who could speak up, you have a responsibility to use that power to create a more just world, not for political reasons, but for moral ones. Nathaniel picked up his wine glass one final time, holding it up slightly, as if making a toast to the room full of people who had become unexpected participants in a masterclass on justice and accountability. "Don't just watch this story and move on," he said, his words directed as much to the live stream audience as to the people in the restaurant. "When you see discrimination happening, in a restaurant, in a workplace, in your community, speak up. Use whatever power you have to make it right." David Kim adjusted his phone angle to capture Nathaniel's final words, knowing instinctively that this was the moment everyone would remember. "Change doesn't happen because of grand gestures or perfect people," Nathaniel continued. "It happens because ordinary people make the choice, in small moments, to do the right thing instead of the easy thing." He set down his wine glass and smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression he had worn since walking into the restaurant 2 hours earlier. "And remember," he said, that smile growing wider as he looked directly into David's camera, "you never know who you're talking to, the person you're tempted to dismiss, to discriminate against, to treat as less than human. They might just be the person who signs your paycheck." The live stream chat exploded with laughter and applause emojis. "But more importantly," Nathaniel added, his expression growing serious again, "treat everyone with dignity, not because they might be your boss, but because it's the right thing to do. Because respect isn't something you earn through power or wealth or position. Respect is something every human being deserves, simply because they're human." He looked around the restaurant one more time, his gaze taking in the faces of employees who were already changed by what they had experienced, customers who would never again be comfortable with casual discrimination, and a live stream audience that had just witnessed justice served in real time. "Choose wisely," Nathaniel concluded. "Choose kindness, choose fairness, choose to be part of the solution." Then, with a final nod to David Kim's camera, he walked toward the front door of Briarwood Grill, his restaurant, his creation, his responsibility, ready to ensure that what had happened today would never happen again. The live stream ended, but the conversation it started was just beginning.